Chapter 14. Garrison's Last Stand. As quickly as things are done, they are also undone. 3 weeks after Lincoln's death, William Lloyd Garrison, who had been steady on his anti-racist journey, producing anti-racist literature in The Liberator, including his critiques of Lincoln's racist political ploys and his work for the American Anti-Slavery Society, called it quits. He announced his retirement. He believed that because emancipation was imminent, his job as an abolitionist was done. But his team, his followers, refused to stop their work and instead shifted their focus to black voting, a focus that leaned toward immediate equality. And while Garrison was trying to bow out gracefully, Lincoln's successor was forcefully breaking in and breaking down what had been, for black people, a breakthrough. His name was Andrew Johnson, and he basically reversed a lot of Lincoln's promises, allowing Confederate states to bar blacks from voting and making sure their emancipation was upheld only if black people didn't break laws. Black codes, social codes used to stop black people from living freely, were created. They would quickly evolve into Jim Crow laws, which were laws that legalized racial segregation. No need for the loopholes anymore. All this was under President Johnson's watch. He emboldened the Ku Klux Klan, allowing them to wreck black lives with no consequence, and enshrined those racist codes and laws. Turned out, freedom in America was like quicksand. It looked solid until a black person tried to stand on it. Then it became clear that it was a sinkhole. Anti-racists were fighting against all these things. Some people, like Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, even fought for the redistribution of land to award former slaves 40 acres to work for themselves. But the arguments against this plan were relentless and racist, presented in this strange way that makes the freed black person seem stupid. How would they know how to care for the land if it's just given to them? Really? And guess who was quiet? William Lloyd Garrison. Having suffered 2 bad falls in 1866 that physically sidelined him, he chose not to engage in the political struggle against racial discrimination. But he still looked on, watching the racist roadblocks being erected at every turn and the political and physical violence working to break the bones of black liberation. Yes, Garrison still looked on, his ideas about gradual equality still evolving. After all, it had been his genius, whether he knew it or not, that it transformed abolitionism from a messy political stance like Jefferson's to a simple moral stance. Slavery was evil, and those racists justifying or ignoring slavery were evil, and it was the moral duty of the United States to eliminate the evil of slavery. Boom. Andrew Johnson was one of the evil. He did everything he could to keep black people as free slaves. In response, black people had to fight to build their own institutions, their own spaces to thrive, like colleges, or as they're now called, historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. From there came the black male politician, and eventually on February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was made official. The amendment made it so that no one could be prohibited from voting due to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But the thing about this amendment, as well as the 13th and 14th, was that there were loopholes. Racist loopholes. Potholes. See, the amendment doesn't state that black politicians would be protected, or that the voting requirements would be equal. Even so, racists didn't want the amendment to be pushed through because they saw giving the right to vote to all black people as the establishment of some kind of black supremacy. Really, it was just black equality, black opportunity. Black people from Boston to Richmond to Vicksburg, Mississippi, planned grand celebrations after the ratification. For their keynote speaker, several communities invited a living legend back to the main stage. William Lloyd Garrison. The 15th Amendment was a big deal. But here's the thing about big deals. If people aren't careful, they can be tricked into believing a big deal is a done deal. Like there's no more fight left. No reason to keep pushing. That freedom is an actual destination. And that's how Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society felt. Like their jobs were done. They disbanded in 1870. Everyone let their guard down, and the racists were right there with right hooks and uppercuts to the face of freedom. Bring on the white terrorism. Bring on more propaganda about brute and savage blacks. Bring on black people doing their best to fight back. Black empowerment. Bring on women fighting back. Women empowerment. Bring on political pacifiers. Bring on more talks about colonization, this time to the Dominican Republic. Bring on domestic migration to Kansas, freedom from a second slavery. It was this, black people moving to safer pastures like Kansas, that William Lloyd Garrison supported at the end of his life. With black people eager to leave the South, eager to give themselves a chance at safety, Kansas seemed to make more sense than the ever-present conversation of colonization to Africa, or even the North, or the Far West. Northern allies worked tirelessly to raise money for Southern black people who wanted to flee Mississippi or Louisiana. Garrison, now 74, his abolitionist heart still pumping, exhausted himself gathering resources for hundreds of black people on the move toward Kansas. It was the best he could do. He'd wanted immediate emancipation. He now even wanted immediate equality. Neither of those things happened during the Reconstruction after the Civil War, and neither of them would in his lifetime. Section 4, 1868 to 1963. Chapter 15, Battle of the Black Brains. This is a reminder. This is not a history book, but there are some names in this story that you've read in history books. Names you know, at least names you should know. It's okay if you don't know them because that's what this not history book is for, but I'm sure you know this one because his name definitely comes up every February. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or as he was known when he was younger, Willie Du Bois, or as he was known when he was older, W.E.B. Du Bois, because nicknames are awesome when you have 4 names. He and his brother were raised in Massachusetts by a single mother who struggled to take care of them. Young Willie was hit with his first racial experience on an interracial playground when he was 10 years old in the same way many of us experienced our first racial experiences. A girl refused a card from him. Okay, maybe this isn't the first racial experience for a lot of us, but a lot of us have experienced and will experience this kind of rejection. Some of us will experience it romantically. She, he, they just aren't that into you. And others of us, like Du Bois, will experience it as a direct result of our differences. In his case, his biggest difference was the color of his skin. That's all he needed to begin competing with his white classmates, determined to convince them that he was not different. And if he was different, it was because he was better. W.E.B. Du Bois didn't know it at 10 years old, but he was going to become the king of uplift suasion. The king of I can do anything they can do. The king of if I'm like you, will you love me? Making him without a doubt the black king of assimilation. At least for a while, but we'll get to all that. For now, let's get into how Du Bois as a teenager decided, like Phyllis Wheatley a few generations before him, that he wanted to go to Harvard. All white Harvard. But of course, that wasn't an option. So the townspeople, good white folks, pooled their money and sent young Willie to Fisk University in Nashville, the best black school in the country, and the top of the top when it came to teaching black people uplift suasion. Du Bois gobbled up the lessons on how to win white people over, and after his time at Fisk, Du Bois was able to put what he'd learned about assimilation into practice. His dream had come true. He got into Harvard to earn a postgraduate degree. But not only did he get in, he did so well there that he even spoke at his graduation. W.E.B. Du Bois had graduated from the best black school and the best white school, proving the capabilities of black people, at least in his own mind. Like I said, he was obsessed with keeping up with white people, running their race. But in his speech, he gave credit to Jefferson Davis, saying that the Confederate president represented some kind of rugged individualism as opposed to the submissive nature of the slave. Yikes. Just as John Cotton and Richard Mather had planned several generations before, these ideas were coming out of Du Bois' Ivy League classrooms, where he'd basically been fed the same narrative that black people had been ruined by slavery. That they were irredeemable, in desperate need of fixing, but unfortunately unfixable, which meant he was obviously exceptional and an exception. But the root of his exceptionalism, his excellence, came from his being biracial. It must have. According to one of Du Bois' intellectual mentors, mulattoes were practically the same as any white man. Du Bois even went so far as to blame black people for being mistreated. Blame them for fighting back, which meant he blamed them for being lynched. For instance, when white people challenged the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, by attaching an educational qualification to what was supposed to be a freedom for all, Du Bois, an educated man, found fault in the black rage and found justification in the white response to the black rage, because black people were breaking the law by wanting white people to stop breaking the law, that they were wrong for wanting to live. And Du Bois wasn't the only black man who believed that black men were bad. Booker T. Washington, the shining star of Tuskegee Institute, a college that cranked out black brilliance, believed this, and even a dying Frederick Douglass did. As a matter of fact, it took a young anti-racist black woman to set these racist men straight. Ida B. Wells Barnett was an investigative journalist who did the necessary research to expose the inconsistencies in the data. In a pamphlet she published in 1892 called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, she found that from the sampling of 728 lynching reports, only a third of black men lynched had actually ever been charged with rape, to say nothing of those who were innocent of the charge. White men were lying about black-on-white rape and hiding their own assaults of black women. But the accusation of rape could make it easier for Southern white men to puff up and act maliciously, all in the name of defending the honor of white women. And Du Bois didn't challenge it. Do the crime, do the time. Don't do the crime, die. I know, W.E.B. Du Bois doesn't really sound that awesome, so let's talk about someone else. Booker T. Washington. Strike that thing I just said if I have a few lines up. Actually, don't strike it because it's true, but there's more. Booker T. Washington wanted blacks to focus on what would now be called blue-collar work. While Du Bois was rubbing elbows in the halls of the White Academy, Washington was in the fields. Well, not really. Though he was the head of Tuskegee, his push for civil rights was more of a backdoor approach. After Frederick Douglass's death in 1895, Washington stepped into his place as the new leader of black America, and though privately he supported empowerment, what he advised was that black people publicly focus on lower pursuits, such as tending the fields. Labor. Common work. Because he knew that would be more acceptable to white people. Knew they would eat it up. Why wouldn't they? A black man saying post-slavery that black people should be happy with the bottom because at least the bottom is a dignified start. For white people, that sounded perfect because it meant there was a greater chance black people would stay out of positions of power and therefore would never actually have any. Oof. I guess Booker T. Washington really doesn't sound that great either. Du Bois believed in being like white people to eliminate threats so that black people could compete. Washington believed in eliminating thoughts of competition so that white people wouldn't be threatened by black sustainability. And there were black people who believed both men because, though we're critiquing their assimilationist ideas in this moment, they were thought leaders of their time. The wildest part about these two men is that they didn't get along. They were like the Biggie and Tupac of their day, or maybe Michael Jackson and Prince. Maybe Malcolm and Martin. They believed in the destination, which was black freedom, but regarding the journey there, they couldn't have disagreed more. Du Bois, the hyper-intellectual golden child, and Washington, the man of the people. Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folks, which intellectualized who black people really were, and Washington wrote Up from Slavery, which outlined the diligence, faith, and fortitude it took and takes to survive in America, coupled with the idea of the white savior. Stories featuring white people having anti-racist epiphanies or moments of empathy resulting in the saving of black people White savior stories were becoming a fixture in American media, and the problem with them wasn't that there weren't any good white people in real life, it's that the stories gave the illusion that they were more than they really were, that white people in general were once again the saviors of black people. Because of that, partially, Up From Slavery was a hit. And Du Bois couldn't take it. He couldn't stomach the fact that Washington was in the spotlight, shining. Washington was even invited to the White House once Theodore Roosevelt got into office, while the always sophisticated Du Bois publicly critiqued Washington, calling him old-fashioned for being so accommodating to white people, for presenting the idea that black people should find dignity through work, and that no education was complete without the learning of a trade. Meanwhile, his own book, The Souls of Black Folk, set out to establish the mere fact that black people were complex human beings. It was in this work that Du Bois introduced the idea of double consciousness, a two-ness, a self that is black and a self that is American. And from that, he fashioned a sample set of black people who sat at the converging point. Black people to be positive representatives of the race. Like, if blackness, good blackness, was a brand, Du Bois wanted these black people to be the ambassadors of that brand. 1 in every 10 he believed were worthy of the job. He called them the talented 10th. Though Du Bois was against accommodating white people, at least that's what he criticized Washington for, he was still the same man fighting for white approval. He still believed that he could think and dress and speak racism away. No matter what he said about Washington's antics and accommodation, W.E.B. Du Bois was in fact still the emperor of uplift suasion. But Du Bois would get a wake-up call, a slap in the face even. Not from Washington, but from a man named Franz Boas, who had immigrated to America from Germany in 1886 because of anti-Jewish persecution. Boas had become one of America's most prominent anthropologists and had been drawing similarities between the way his people were mistreated in Germany and the way black people were being mistreated in America, with each nation justifying the treatment by saying the persecuted group was naturally inferior. Same story, different book. But in 1906, when Du Bois asked Boas to come speak at Atlanta University, where he was teaching, he had no idea what he was in for. Boas affirmed that the idea that black people are naturally inferior, or even that they've been made inferior from slavery, was false, and all one needed to do to prove this was dig through the history of black people before they got to America. Black people had a history, and that history, an African history, wasn't one of inferiority. Instead, it was one full of glorious empires, like those of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, full of intellects and innovators. Du Bois's head blew right off his shoulders. At least that's the way I imagine it. Either way, his mind and all the white mumbo-jumbo he'd consumed had started to change. But the intellectual high wouldn't last because by the end of that same year, black people helped Republicans regain the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. And as soon as they did, Roosevelt, the president who'd invited Booker T. Washington to his house, the most popular president among black people ever, kicked a bunch of black soldiers out of the army without any money. 167 soldiers to be exact. A dozen of them had been falsely accused of murdering a bartender and wounding a cop in Texas. These soldiers of the 25th Infantry Regiment were a point of pride for black America. For them to be mistreated as fighters for a country that had been fighting against them their entire lives was a blow to the black psyche. And just like that, Roosevelt was seen as a backstabber by black people. And because Booker T. Washington was Roosevelt's guy, his man, his black friend, Washington also had to feel the wrath when the president hurt his people. Due to the social blow Booker T. Washington took because of his familiar and friendly history with Roosevelt, Du Bois's talented 10th rose in influence.